Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's debate. My name is Ruben Visser and I'm the chairman, and Tom is the timekeeper. The adjudicator is Mr. Moritz. The topic of this debate is that the cost of the COVID-19 pandemic is worse than the virus. The affirmative team seated to my right is from Aberfoyle Park High School. The negative team seated to my left is from Rostrevor College. The speaking time for this debate is 6 minutes. A single warning bell will sound 1 minute before the speaking time, and a double bell will sound at the speaking time. A continuous bell may be rung 30 seconds after the speaking time, in which case the speaker must sit down immediately. Please switch off your mobile devices and other electronic devices. I declare this debate open and call upon the first affirmative speaker, Conan Kaboy.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that the cost of the COVID-19 pandemic is worse than the virus. Before I move on to my case, I would like to give an extensive definition for tonight's topic, as this particular topic is very broad and can be interpreted in a number of ways. First and foremost, we believe that cost is not limited to economic costs. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, cost is defined as something that is given, needed, or lost in order to get a particular thing. In this case, this particular thing being protection from the virus. We define the virus as the direct impacts the coronavirus itself has had on humans, causing illness and in some cases leading to death. This means that any other impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic can be considered a cost. Furthermore, in this specific context, we define the word worse concerning how and to what extent the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted people. Finally, whilst we acknowledge that a pandemic is defined as the worldwide spread of a new disease, our arguments will be focused on the impacts the virus has had on Australia. This is because how and to what extent this pandemic has affected each country, as well as the responses to it, are far too different, making it impossible to universalise this topic. Overall, we define the topic as the sacrifices that we have made to protect ourselves from the virus has had a worse impact than the virus itself, specifically in Australia. We, the affirmative team, believe this statement to be true. Tonight as a team, we will be largely focusing on the long-term impacts that the cost of this pandemic can have. As first speaker, I will be talking to you about the scale of the cost of this pandemic, as well as the detrimental mental health impacts caused by it. Our second speaker will be discussing the economic side of our argument, including the tourism and education industry, and our third speaker will rebut and sum up our team case. Now to my case. Tonight I will be discussing 2 points. My first point is that the cost of the pandemic has impacted people on a significantly larger scale. According to the Australian Department of Health, only 0.2% of Australians have actually contracted the virus itself, but every single person has been affected by the pandemic in some way or another, whether that be having to wear masks, or having their jobs affected, or not being able to see certain friends or family. But however, all of these aren't the direct cause of the virus itself. These are all costs that we are having to pay in order to protect ourselves and others from the virus, and millions of others in Australia and around the world are experiencing these things, if not worse. In fact, according to ABC News, Australia's 2 biggest states, New South Wales and Victoria, have abandoned the COVID-0 strategy, which is a term used to describe the goal of having 0 infections and ultimately the complete eradication of the virus. According to BBC News, measures such as lockdowns and border closures have received criticism by Australians, and I quote, for the cost to people's livelihoods and mental well-being. And on top of this, 62% of Australians support the government's decision on abandoning COVID-0. Not only this, but numerous experts on varying news platforms has expressed that the idea of COVID-0 is simply unrealistic. Health experts, the government, and the majority of Australians have decided that abandoning COVID-0 and learning to live with the virus is the best and only realistic option, putting something as significant as people's physical safety in danger, because the cost they are paying to protect these lives is far more damaging and impacts people on a much larger scale. Next, I will be discussing the psychological costs that the pandemic has and will continue to have. Firstly, due to the unpredictable nature of this virus and pandemic, when or if seriously affected industries will recover is unclear. This means countless people are struggling with unemployment or loss of income, and they don't even know when this nightmare is going to end. And studies conducted by a researcher from the Institute of Social Medicine has shown that financial struggles can lead to depression, stress, or even suicidal thoughts. On a wider lens, numerous psychologists and psychiatrists, including Yuko Nikoda, a psychotherapist for the UK Council for Psychotherapy, explain that generalised anxiety and OCD are one of the most concerned when it comes to long-term impacts of the pandemic. On top of this, lockdowns and pressure to not leave the house has acted as a catalyst for domestic abuse. According to a survey conducted by the Australian Institute of Criminology, 2/3 of women who had experienced domestic abuse during the COVID-19 crisis said the attack started or became worse during the pandemic. In addition to this, people are unable to do things outside the house that may have been a great support to their well-being prior to the pandemic, such as regular exercise classes and catching up with friends. All of this, tied in with other difficulties in life, can lead some people to want to hurt themselves or even take their own lives. Although direct suicide rates have not increased from the pandemic, according to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, there was a 17.6% increase since the onset of COVID-19 in use of crisis lines and number of ambulance attendants for suicidal thoughts and self-harm. And let's not forget that just because someone hasn't hurt themselves or taken their own life, it doesn't invalidate their suffering, nor does it make their emotions and fears any less significant. Mental health issues can last for years or be lifelong, and it starts to affect every aspect of life. And as warned by a group of leading public health specialists in the British Medical Journal, the mental health impact of the pandemic is likely to last much longer than the physical health impact. So, in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, we, the Affirmative team, believe that the cost of the COVID-19 pandemic is clearly worse than the virus due to the devastating mental health impacts, as well as the time, extent, and amount of people that it has and will continue to have an impact on. Thank you.
I call upon the first negative speaker, Marshall Nitschke.
Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, and chairman. As mentioned by the first affirmative speaker, our topic of debate is that the cost of the COVID pandemic is worse than the virus, which is a statement we, as the negative team, do not condone. We agree with the definition provided by the affirmative team. Tonight I'll be providing a detailed contextualisation of the perils of the pandemic and its unpredictable nature, before illuminating the cost of not acting in a case study between two nations who adopted unique measures to combat the virus. Our second speaker, Harrison, will explore the role played by the United Nations and governments, as well as critique the role of the media in providing misinformation before flagging those who have benefited from responses to the virus. And our third speaker, Charlie, will refute the ideas raised by the opposition and summarise our case. Prior to raising my own points, I'd like to rebut some of the notions raised by the first affirmative speaker. The first affirmative speaker argued that lockdowns and restrictions to reach COVID-0 were unnecessary. This is factually incorrect, as a study by Professor Olga Yakasheva of the University of Michigan and a team of health economists concurred that by the end of 2020, public health measures to mitigate COVID-19, including shelter-in-place orders, school and business closures, social distancing and face mask recommendations, have saved between 900,000 and 2.7 million lives in the US alone. The team reached the conclusion that the public health measures to stop the spread of COVID-19 are justified and in the best interest of our society. Now on to my points. Ladies and gentlemen, amidst this turbulent and unprecedented time of the COVID-19 pandemic, the question has been posed by expert health officials, governing leaders across the globe, and academics worldwide. How can a price, be it resource-based or monetary, be placed on attempts to safeguard the well-being of human beings? Insight from the World Health Organization and SA Health denote that there have been over 215 million known cases globally, along with over 4 million deaths. In a national context, the common opinion is that we, Australia, were lucky in the pandemic proceedings, which can skew our view of the bigger picture at times, with over 60,000 known cases and over 1,000 deaths. For those affected, the symptoms vary and include, per advice from SA Health, loss of taste and smell, discoloration of fingers or toes, difficulty breathing, loss of speech and or movement, and severe respiratory failure. Just as concerning is the rate at which the disease travels. Detailed by World Health, transferable by touching a surface, coughing or sneezing. It can manifest as a life-threatening circumstance for those you and I hold most dear, with people ranging from their 20s to over 100, according to health.gov. COVID-19 has been significantly stymied by the action taken by way of lockdowns, working from home and other measures for what has been described by world leaders as the greater good. Healthcare and political commentators alike, including Australia's Professor Michael Kidd, have asked the public for empathy and to simply imagine the hardship of losing a loved one to the pandemic. Hence, the cost cannot in any way be seen as worse than the virus. My second point tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is regarding the cost of not acting. The Affirmative team has adopted a case whereby fiscal concerns must be made a priority, and certainly we are not naive enough to appreciate that. However, it is via the case study of Sweden and the implementation of herd immunity that we can identify a clear insight as to the possible ramifications that can occur due to COVID-19, which is a far greater cost as opposed to what our opposition have flagged. Contextually, for those unfamiliar with the action taken by the Swedish governance, as a way of limiting costs and resources appropriate to virus, the state adopted what is deemed herd immunity strategies. Certainly, while herd immunity has never been confirmed as official policy according to various sources, Professor Goldsmith of the Royal Society of Medicine remains adamant that Sweden was essentially hoping that enough of its population would develop antibodies and that infection rates would start to drop after 6 to 12 months. Insight from the ABC affirms that Sweden's failed coronavirus gamble came at a high cost of lives, statistics showing that the neighbour Norway had over 10 times less casualties and fatalities, and the country could still have to implement a lockdown to tackle the spread of what in 2020 was a second wave emerging in September, experts say. My final point tonight is regarding the unpredictable nature of the virus, which continues to mutate and change, placing more lives at risk. Dr. Sutherland, who functions as an advisor for the New Zealand PM Jacinda Ardern, best exemplifies the need to be proactive to combat variants of the virus, such as the Delta variant that has struck Auckland, which has added a level 2 plus of lockdown measures. Sutherland states that this was necessary because human behaviour was such that if we were to return to work or school, we'd likely fall back into old patterns that don't include physical distancing. Delta needed a barrier to stop it spreading, and mandatory mask wearing would provide that. The big change is to redesign Alert Level 2, so it actually provides some major protection. Furthermore, the doctor cites combating mental health concerns, saying that the longer we go on, especially with Auckland at Level 4, more people get COVID fatigue from being in limbo, said Dr. Dougal Sutherland, a Victoria University of Wellington and Umbrella Health clinical psychologist. Having to wait around, people aren't able to do very much. They're feeling bored and restless. Some emotions come with that. People get annoyed and frustrated. The longer this goes on, it's more likely people will get like that. However, the decreasing number of cases could also keep people placid, he said. It's a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel. In contrast, the cost of not acting would merely see several cities across the globe lost in a directionless milieu devoid of safety measures, whilst the virus continued to thrive, mutate and become more deadly. In summary, we cannot allow ourselves to be indoctrinated by cold and contextless statistics, but rather recognise the excruciating pain, suffering and death we have managed to evade. Cost-cutting solutions have turned out fatal, as proved by the Sweden case study, and defending human beings from an unpredictable and ever-changing virus is worth every single cent. Thank you.
I call upon the second affirmative speaker, Daniel Bland.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Daniel, and I'm the second affirmative speaker for this evening. The topic for tonight's debate is that the cost of the COVID-19 pandemic is worse than the virus. We, the affirmative team, believe this statement to be true. Before I move on to my case, I would first like to address the points made by the negative team. The first negative speaker has tried to refer to international examples as a way of acting upon the virus. As this is wrong because, as by our definition, we said solely Australia. Everyone's approach is different. Therefore, the way we approach things to, say, a country like Sweden is different. Therefore, all international examples are invalid to our country. Now, to briefly recap our case so far. Our first speaker has already explained that the costs of the COVID-19 pandemic affect people on a much larger scale and is more damaging. This was supported by experts, the government, and the majority of Australians agreeing that they had to learn to live with the virus, since the costs of the pandemic are far worse and long-lasting. She also discussed the psychological costs of the pandemic and how it is likely to last much longer than the physical impacts of the pandemic. Now, to my case. Due to diversity in international responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, it is only suitable to focus on the local response. The COVID pandemic has posed issues in many sectors of the Australian economy. One such sector who relies more and more on international money as a source of income is the education sector, in particular universities. Universities in Australia are an important pathway for many future endeavours. Given the current climate for uneven border closures between states and being closed off to many other countries, this creates instability and uncertainty for all sectors. This brings me to my first point. International students are the ones that universities target to increase their revenue, as they make up one of the largest portions of profit for the establishments. According to Statista.com, in 2018, international student fees made $8.84 billion in revenue. Furthermore, according to an article written by The Conversation, that statistic increased in 2019 to $10 billion. From the same article, to which I quote, to further reinstate the importance of international students, from the same article, to which I quote, in total 32% of full-time equivalent enrolments at Australian universities are international students. About a quarter, 24% of all university revenue comes from these students, end quote. Just about a quarter of all university revenue comes from international students. A quarter is a huge amount, billions of dollars lost. This impacts the resources that the universities have, the staff, and the future projects and investments for many, many years to come. According to Universities Australia, universities across the nation have removed 17,300 jobs alone in 2020 due to the pandemic. The reduction of staff will also have impacted the courses too, as now knowing the funding is being cut. Undoubtedly, there will have to be a small number of those selecting available courses. Parents are also worried about the long-term effects of online learning at home. According to an article written on 31st of August by The Advertiser, 61% of parental figures worry about the detrimental long-term impacts of lockdowns. So, the cost of education, not only for universities, but for future students enrolling in either high schools, university, TAFE, any mid to high degree of education, their learning abilities will have been declining as a result in the shift towards online learning. If this loss of all the listed problems, such as less international students and online school, are going to limit the potential of not only international students, but also domestic students, the students of whom, no matter where they came from or which degree of education they are in, who are the future of the world, are not able to receive the same opportunity to excel with more developed buildings and resources that otherwise would be there pre-pandemic, then that would create a domino effect in regards to the future of this country. Now, to my second point, to further reinstate the issues that are a cause of the pandemic. The tourism industry has been impacted deeply. All throughout 2020, we have had the many fears that come about due to the pandemic, and justifiably so. According to Tourism Australia, the tourism industry employed 666,000 Australians back in the 2018 to 19 financial year. This accounted for 5% of the total Australian workforce. 5% is a large amount to consider when it comes to economic value. Furthermore, according to the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, towards the end of 2019, it had 748,200 people employed. Contrasting this to the end of June 2020, where there were about 611,700 employed. This means that there are about 137,000 people out of work within the first half of the year, which makes about 18.24% of the initial workforce lost. This is a huge amount of the workforce. Thousands of Australians out of work, out of their jobs, and searching for employment. In conclusion, the pandemic has destroyed many industries that are vital to the current economy and the future. The university is going to struggle to stay afloat, restricting courses and future projects that would otherwise be occurring at this moment. With extreme uncertainty, the past year, the effects will have thank you.
I call upon the second negative speaker, Harrison Lynch.
Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, and Mr. Chairman. As we are aware, the topic of tonight's debate is that the cost of the pandemic is worse than the virus, which is an idea we strongly oppose. Tonight, I'll be exploring additional ideas that complement our stance by arguing that governments across the world are doing everything they can to support all people through this time. Furthermore, I will also explain the positive outcomes that are direct results of the pandemic. Before raising my own points though, I'd like to review some limitations found in the opposition's case. The second affirmative speaker claimed that their team categorically defined the debate as only concerning Australia. However, their first speaker merely suggested that they would focus themselves on Australian costs. Furthermore, Marshall used examples from other countries to emphasise the importance of Australian lockdowns and restrictions. The second affirmative speaker also stated that the restrictions implemented to halt the spread of the virus have led to the loss of thousands of jobs in Australia. However, they failed to note the significant amount of jobs that the government have saved by noting the potential effects of such restrictions. As alluded to in our first speaker's speech, the entire Australian National Cabinet have taken into account the real impacts that these measures could have on the daily lives of Australians, and as such, will do all they can to support Australians throughout the course of the pandemic. This support came in the form of JobKeeper wage subsidy for businesses significantly impacted by coronavirus, which, according to the Royal Bank of Australia, saved at least 700,000 jobs. Of course, the impacts of government-imposed restrictions were widespread, but the people behind such a decision have ensured that the support was provided to give millions of eligible businesses and their workers a lifeline to not only get through this crisis, but bounce back together on the other side, as Prime Minister Scott Morrison said. But aside from being the only viable option, the government have ensured that they were lessened as much as possible to minimise unemployment rates from rising, whilst providing buoyancy for the businesses of the people of Australia. Now, onto my points. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you, what is the purpose of a government? By definition, it is to maintain the well-being of a society. So, in our current context, irrelevant of which side you're on, you must agree that whatever decisions are made, they will be made with the best intentions for the society as a whole. Therefore, it is crucial that governments worldwide have the best support and advice from health experts, and this is endorsed by the United Nations, regardless of cost. Currently, the pandemic is costing the global economy $375 billion a month and 500 million jobs since the crisis erupted. The United Nations policy on the matter states that focus needs to remain on addressing the root cause of the economic crisis, which is COVID-19. In this regard, the World Health Organization has provided governments comprehensive guidance on effective public health measures. Safe and effective vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics will also be vital for ending the pandemic and accelerating the global recovery. It has also become abundantly clear that it is in every country's national and economic self-interest to work cohesively to expand access to tests and treatments and to support a vaccine as a global public good. The Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, ACT Accelerator, with its COVAX facility, is the best global solution for getting us there. Longer term, pandemic preparedness and response can be seen as a global public good, with commensurate global and national level investments. Ladies and gentlemen, to suggest that the cost of the COVID-19 pandemic is worse than the virus would be to contradict the proactive and innovative stance held by the United Nations in their endeavours to pragmatically safeguard lives. Secondly, it would be undeniably ignorant of us to ignore the silver linings of the pandemic. Of course, there are restrictions, economic losses, and time away from loved ones. However, there have been many positive outcomes that are entirely attributed to the pandemic. We already know the monumental innovation and progression of technology over the past years. But in a world where people are constantly in and out of lockdowns and restrictions for whatever reason, or have decided to work from home, technology has rapidly evolved to fulfill our needs and enable life and business to continue. For instance, online video conference and work platforms, Teams and Zoom, grew by 725% and 326% respectively in 2020 alone, according to The Economist. While data from Business Standard denotes that over the course of the pandemic, the pharmaceutical company Pfizer experienced an increase in net income of 50%. This growth has enabled them to develop and provide us with services that have allowed the continuation of producing vaccines and remains the planet's best chance of eliminating COVID. Would they have developed and grown by such an extent had we simply continued without any restrictions or lockdowns as the opposition believes we should have? No. Finally, social misinformation based on fear, not facts, as evident in countless newspaper articles and publications which detail shocking economic losses prompt considerable, though inaccurate, concerns globally. Specifically, is it advised by the International Monetary Fund that governments should continue to provide income support through well-targeted cash transfers, wage subsidies, and unemployment insurance. To prevent large-scale bankruptcies and ensure workers can return to productive jobs, vulnerable but viable firms should continue to receive support wherever possible, through tax deferrals, moratoria on debt services, and equity-like injections. Data from the WEO depicts that the UK economy would shrink by 9.8% this year. This is an improvement on the 10.2% decline forecast earlier in the year. While the US is expected to be the least affected of the major advanced economies, the IMF expects a contraction in output of 4.3%. Thereby, governments have proven to overcome the costs committed to the virus. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, whilst the pandemic has caused challenges, there have been many direct beneficiaries. This is made clear through the crucial development of vaccines, as well as social and economic gains by way of technology. Crucially, It remains the proactive measures taken by governments that require respect and acknowledgement, as according to SA Health, they will and are ensuring sustainable futures. Thank you.
I call upon the third affirmative speaker, Cadence Butterfield.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that the cost of the COVID-19 pandemic is worse than the virus. As the affirmative team, we believe this statement to be completely and 100% true. Before rebutting the points made by the negative team, I would like to briefly respond to the comment made regarding the definition by the second negative speaker. While as a team, we acknowledge that the fact that the pandemic is a global occurrence. However, the way it was handled and the impact it has had on all 195 countries of the world is far too different, which is something that the first and second affirmative speaker very explicitly explained. Now I would like to address and refute the arguments made by the negative team. The first negative speaker has stated that the measures of the pandemic are justifiable due to the lives that were saved. However, we are not saying that this is not the case in any way, shape or form. However, the idea that these costs can be justified doesn't at all make them inexistent, severe or long-lasting. They also stated that COVID-19 is unpredictable. We acknowledge this fact, and in fact this point actually supports our argument in a way, as we cannot predict when or if seriously affected industries and people will recover, which is something the first affirmative speaker stated. He also discussed the danger of mutations of the virus and its transmission rate. Of course, this is a possibility and one that is currently occurring, especially with the extremely infective Delta strain. However, what he has failed to mention is that mutations and high transmissions of the virus result in a much more severe government and public response, which will only elongate and worsen the existing lockdown restrictions. Ultimately, this will increase the cost of the pandemic, socially, economically, psychologically and environmentally, which is much greater than what the virus itself, mutated or not, could actually do. For example, after seeing a rise in Delta cases in Australia, specifically Sydney, the Department of Health has stated in multiple articles that the main thing that should be done in response to this is ensuring a 2-dose vaccination of as many Australians as possible. Of course, a vaccine is an extremely effective idea, both scientifically and historically speaking. However, it is also a costly one. Contributing to research alone, the Australian government has funded around $350 million. As far as the developed vaccines go, the country has entered into 5 separate agreements, which will secure the country with around 280 million doses of vaccines, if proven to be successful. These agreements have cost the country over $8 billion. This is a lot of money, but does not compare to the estimated $170 billion that the pandemic has cost the Australian economy. First negative speaker also stated that the virus has had extremely long-term symptoms. However, the direct impacts that the virus has had only affects less than 3% of the world population, according to Worldometers. In comparison, due to lockdowns, loss of jobs, use of masks, and general restrictions, the pandemic has impacted billions of people's lives. Of course, this is not to imply that some lives are worth more than others. However, it is very apparent, based on this statistic, that the pandemic has been on a much larger scale and thus will take much longer to repair if it ever does. The second negative speaker has tried to tell you that the government is doing their best in supporting the pandemic. However, this isn't really relevant to the topic. This doesn't prove at all whether or not the COVID-19 virus is worse than the cost of the pandemic. They also said that there are benefits to lockdown, such as the technological advancements. However, this again does not prove that the cost is worse or better than the virus, and does not at all undermine the costs of the pandemic that do exist. He also briefly mentioned that costs stem from the virus, so that must mean it's worse. However, regardless of the fact that the virus is the cause of the pandemic, that doesn't mean that the impacts of them are the same, because fundamentally speaking, the virus and the pandemic themselves are two different things, and it is completely crucial that they are treated as such. Moving on, I would now like to summarise my team's case. The first affirmative speaker, Conan, stated that the virus only directly impacts a smaller and much more specific portion of people, while the pandemic impacts the population on a much larger scale. She also mentioned the extremely small amount of Australians that actually contracted the virus, according to the Australian Department of Health. Then she talked about how the pandemic has caused a massive increase of levels of anxiety, depression, poverty, as well as a lack of escape for those who are victims of domestic abuse and violence. She then talked about how all of these factors have resulted in changed levels of suicides and self-injury, as well as the great long-term impact of increased generalised anxiety disorder and OCD, which are very frightening issues. The second affirmative speaker, Dan, then discussed the impact of the pandemic on the economy. First, he discussed the impact on education, specifically universities, due to a much smaller number of international and domestic students enrolling in them. Next, he discussed the impact on the tourism industry, highlighting the large amount of people out of work due to the pandemic, especially considering the portion of the Australian workforce that resides in jobs within tourism. So, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, we, the affirmative team, strongly believe that the environmental, economical, social and psychological costs of the pandemic are far, far worse than the actual virus or disease itself. This is because of its more long-lasting nature and how the impacts on the population are much more severe and on a larger scale. Thank you.
I call upon the third negative speaker, Charlie Crafter.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. As I'm sure you're aware, the topic of debate tonight is that the cost of the COVID-19 pandemic is worse than the virus, a statement we, the negative team, oppose profusely. In what is such a topical and divisive subject matter, I can only hope that through the insight and rebuttal already presented tonight by Marshall and Harry, we all share a clear understanding that anything that has the capacity to infect and murder millions of people around the world must be fought, no matter the cost. Prior to completing a summary of my team's primary points, I'd first like to highlight some of the limitations evident in the arguments of our opposition. The first affirmative speaker has said that mental health and associated issues need to be given a higher priority than what has been given to COVID-19. Though naturally there has been an increase in research placed into the development of insights pertaining to nullifying, eradicating and preventing the spread of COVID, it has obviously been deemed worthy by treasurers and governing bodies across the globe, per insight from the UN and WHO, who identify the, and I quote, human rights, debt, socioeconomic impact, tourism, jobs, education, inequality, food and security and mental health aspects of all welfare challenges, and work extensively to support as much as they can. Essentially, the opposition are attempting to downplay a situation and crisis, flagged as requiring research and energy by experts and professionals, which is an ideal we must refute. The second affirmative speaker has stated that lockdowns and restrictions will cause unnecessary strain on the economy, especially through border restrictions. As expressed earlier by our first speaker, Marshall, this is a narrow-minded approach that fails to recognise the lives saved by government protective measures and grossly hyperbolises the impact on the economy. In 2003, 8,422 cases of severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus, or SARS, were recorded across the globe, resulting in 774 known deaths. Despite this minuscule spread compared to our 2019 coronavirus, SARS wiped $40 billion off global markets. Due to the low case numbers and infection rate of SARS, governments were not forced to implement social distancing measures of the likes we've experienced in the last year and a half. Yet the economy was still decimated. My point is, ladies and gentlemen, the viruses such as SARS and COVID-19 take a burdensome toll on global economies, regardless of the level of government restrictions implemented. Our Australian government's action should be applauded, as had they not acted as swiftly and effectively, as demonstrated by Sweden, the cost would not be in stocks, but in lives. The second affirmative speaker has argued that the cost of the virus will be felt for generations into the future. This is an inaccurate exaggeration of the long-term economic effects of the coronavirus pandemic, as various measures are already being proposed to ease the burden on the Australian population, the greatest of these being the proposed tycoon tax. Proposed by the Greens, this corporate tax plan involves charging billion-dollar companies, who might I add have grown by 25% during this pandemic, who record over $100 million annually, 40% in tax, after fair return to shareholders. According to the Parliamentary Budgeting Office, this tax increase would raise over $338 billion in 10 years should it be implemented, enormously lessening the strain on Australian taxpayers. Finally, the third speaker argued that whether or not the government can aid in the recovery of the nation is irrelevant to the cost of the virus. This is false, as if a cost can be eased by government, then surely it is a cost lessened. I'd argue certainly in the eyes of many Australians battling these days. Now onto my summary. Tonight, our first speaker, Marshall, began by questioning the price of a human life, by considering the subject matter through a pragmatic, more compassionate lens. Crucially, Marshall drew upon the insights of experts to look at action taken to prioritise maintaining the lives of as many people as possible from the deadly virus, whilst also ensuring effective and safe proactive measures could combat the unpredictable nature for COVID-19 and other viruses. Palpably, Marshall was able to create a clear and authentic juxtaposition within his points to examine the diverse actions taken by those in Sweden and the governments in New Zealand, which yielded considerably different outcomes. By critiquing the herd immunity strategy implemented by Sweden, our first speaker was able to clearly demonstrate that the cost of not acting would lead to a minimum of 10 times the infection rates across the globe, as detailed by Professor Goldsmith of the Royal Society of Medicine. Appropriately, it was through Marshall's considering of the directives implemented by New Zealand that revealed how using lockdowns, encouraging social distancing, and having people work from home, thus limiting infection rates and managing mutations such as the Delta variant, showed that the pandemic is definitely worse than the cost. Our second speaker, Harry, argued that the government action based on research backed by experts and endorsed by the United Nations needs to be valued as paramount, as each body remains resolute in combating the virus and saving lives without being repressed by cost. Uniquely, Harry illuminated the fact that despite the headlines reading doom and gloom, there remain profits to be made in certain markets during this time, such as technology and real estate, which will serve to support governments and populations to recover once the virus is contained. Harry concluded his address by ratifying a nation's ability to recover, highlighting a government's willingness to help out not only its own people, but also those in nations less fortunate, which has been the case throughout history, following past pandemics and wars. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, the cost of the coronavirus pandemic has not and will never outweigh the dangers presented by this hostile, mutative virus. We live in a society where no person, organisation or even government hold the right to determine the worth of a human being. And we, the negative team, are determined to keep it that way. Thank you.
We now come to question time. For the next 3 minutes, teams are invited to take turns to ask each other questions about the debate. That is, the affirmative team will ask a question, then the negative team, then the affirmative team, and so on. A team is free to indicate if it has no questions. I now invite the affirmative team to ask its first question.
So we just had a question regarding the definition. So you, the first negative speaker, you agreed with our definition, which said that anything that wasn't considered to be directly related to the disease was considered a cost. So that includes all of the economics and the social and the political aspects. And we also stated that we would mainly focus on Australia, and that's what this debate would be about, because it's impossible to universalise this. But then you made a lot of arguments that were built on a foundation which kind of contradicted this definition. So we were just wondering about your train of thought there.
Yeah, so basically, what we were saying, especially Marshall's point about Sweden and New Zealand, it was providing evidence for why the Australian lockdowns have been effective and why they were so vital in us, being here today, not thousands of cases down.
And I feel like it's impossible to just limit this to a country, because we're connected in this global pandemic, as it is a global pandemic kind of thing.
Also, I think in some of your points you guys were talking about international students coming in and out, and so obviously that's impacted by cases not just in Australia but in other countries. So.
Can I answer to that, or is that not one?
Sure, go ahead.
So I think the point we're trying to make is it's easy to pick and choose evidence if it's made global, because if you wanted to prove that the virus is worse, you could just pick a country that's obviously had 1 million cases. But obviously there's the question of then why would we pick Australia? And then some people think that's biased because Australia hasn't had many cases. But if we can't universalise it and we have to pick one country, we can't just choose a random country like Indonesia or somewhere. So that's why we've limited it to Australia, because we thought that was the best and most realistic way to debate.
Yeah. Well, obviously we didn't go and pick USA or India or anything like that when we were talking about our analysis either. So we did that.
Does the negative team have any
Do we have a
questions?
I think we were right. Yeah.
Does the affirmative team have any more questions to ask?
Hang on, I'll find it. Oh, would you be able to clarify the point you made about the government and how they're trying to do the best for the country and for the pandemic to become better?
Yeah.
We kind of thought the government response was more directly linked to the pandemic rather than the actual virus itself, which we didn't know if that actually proved anything.
Yeah, well, we were saying that obviously governments, their job is to help people, and because of the virus and the effects it has and how bad it is and everything, they needed to go and do that for the people, and so that kind of links it in both points.
So how does that prove that the virus has had a worse impact?
Oh, well, obviously, because it's that bad, they need to do that much to combat it.
Seems like it might be about 3 minutes.
While the adjudicator finalises the results, I will read this evening's chairman's notices. Quarter-final chairman's notices. We are delighted to announce that, subject to COVID restrictions, the grand finals will be held in the House of Assembly Chamber, Parliament House, on Saturday, 25th September 2021. There will likely be a need for RSVP for contact tracing purposes, so please keep an eye out for this information. Year 10 and Senior, would you like to be an adjudicator for primary school debates in 2022? Adjudicating is a great community service and will help to improve your own debating. See the information desk for more information about how to sign up. Topic and site information for the semi-finals will be available on the Debating SA website from tomorrow morning. Please be sure to check your site and debating time information carefully. Debates will be held here at the same time, at the same venue next week. I now invite the adjudicator, Mr. Moritz, forward.
Good evening, everyone. Firstly, congratulations to all the debaters for making it to the quarterfinals. I hope you enjoyed the season as a whole, COVID affected though it was. Feedback tonight, I'm going to focus upon the arguments sort of as a whole, as a team case, rather than sort of giving individual feedback in turn. But I'll kind of point some things out as I go along. So, firstly, to the definition. So, Conan, I think you've articulated really well that definition. It was very well considered, and you put it forth quite well. So, by going step by step and then summing up at the end, that's exactly what we want to see from what is quite a complicated definition. And I think in terms of the definition that you gave, I think it was quite clear and did give parameters for the debate. So sacrifices that we have made to protect ourselves from the virus have a worse impact than the disease itself, and obviously with that focus on Australia. That being said, that made things difficult for your team and for the opposition. And I'll talk about them in a second. So just in your own speech, Conan, I would have liked to have the sources that you had for your information to be a little bit more prominent. You did mention them throughout, but there were times when you kind of there was a bit of a gap between mentioning a source and then the fact, I guess, from that source. So just make them a little bit more prominent. And also, given your definition, you probably need to be a little bit more clear, trying to use more Australian sources and Australian research. And a couple of cases, I think there were, so for example, you mentioned a BBC report where, now I believe, my impression was that it was talking about Australia, but it was just a little bit confusing because BBC, so make sure that's really clear. I'm going to continue with the affirmative case for the moment. Second negative, so Daniel, because of the definition, in both of your topics, I think you needed to be a lot clearer about what the measures that we had taken to protect ourselves from the virus had been. So closing borders, which obviously removes all international travel, and then as well closing schools, and making a comparison needed to be a lot more highlighted in both of your points. So you did a little bit in terms of the university. You talked about sort of the pre-pandemic and what's happening now, but I think you got a little bit bogged down in sort of the figures of, so they're 25% of revenue and X amount of total students and things like that, rather than actually comparing the measures and I guess the costs of that. So there needed to be stronger links made to this specificity of the topic as defined by your first speaker. On just in terms of the arguments on the negative side for the moment, we'll look at the arguments first and then I'm going to come back and talk about the definition. So in general, what I would say about your team is that what you were promising both at the beginning of Marshall's speech and at the sort of in Charlie's summary didn't always match up with what was actually said, particularly by the first and second speaker. So Marshall, for example, I thought you needed to do a little bit more in your case study. So was it Norway or New Zealand? Because I heard you said the neighbouring Norway.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then like Charlie said that you compared them with New Zealand. I thought that was a really good case study to make. Whether it's Norway or New Zealand doesn't really matter. But I think you needed to do a little bit more of that. So there we could have really benefited from, I guess, virus figures perhaps in Sweden compared to which other country you were comparing it to, and a little bit about the differences between their restrictions. So Sweden, if they had virtually none, what other country it was having quite harsh lockdowns, that sort of thing. And then for your case as well, you need to really go further and to actually say, so what no restrictions leads to is breakdown of health system, all those sorts of things. Bad economic consequences anyway, which is what the affirmative team is talking about. And then from Harrison, I thought the sort of silver linings argument that you had was actually a really strong way of going forward, and actually did work quite well in terms of the definition, because the remote work and things are, if we sort of think about the definition, a method that we've used to protect ourselves. And what you argued quite well was that these are actually good things. So they're generating money for the companies and its shareholders. Two, and you could have also gone further with this, they're enabling new ways of work, and particularly as well, so something which you could have also touched on is that they're enabling different types of people to get involved in different types of work. So remote work and the, I guess, explosion of it, is making things more accessible for people with disabilities who previously may not have been able to do a 9-to-5 job, whereas now they might be able to get into that sort of thing. I also particularly, I think this was in rebuttal, but liked and thought you could have made more of, the idea of the support measures again being good. So JobKeeper saving 700,000 jobs, you could make a direct cost comparison there. So that's, I guess, a measure we've taken to protect ourselves, but it's actually paying off well. Because if we didn't have JobKeeper, 700,000 jobs would go, that sort of thing. In terms of the definition, I think as a team, you needed to have amended it to reflect what you were going to be talking about. So you were taking a more global view and then bringing it back to Australia. So I think your case would have been a lot stronger had you flagged, for example, that while we are focusing on the costs in Australia, we will be using international examples to illuminate that cost. I think that would have probably, had we done that, cleared up what became quite a contentious point in the debate, particularly in rebuttal. Because I also think that we do need to use, and this is to both teams, we do need to use international examples to compare, because otherwise we're sort of making up what could happen when we have case studies that we can use. On the rebuttal side of things, going into the definition. So, Daniel, your rebuttal point there sort of, I guess, attempting to render the international examples out of the debate, I guess was correct by your definition, but you could have done more with it. So were there issues with the rebuttal point over and above the fact that as a team you thought it was irrelevant to the topic? So in a definition debate where we have a dispute between the definition, you have to do what's called even if rebuttal, and I think that did need to be applied here, would have really strengthened the rebuttal from the affirmative side in general. And that's for cadence as well, yeah. Cadence? Yes, yeah, okay. I was doubting myself, I know there's not another N in there. I thought you did quite well to cover off the major points that the negative had made, but I was I thought for you it became a little bit confusing in terms of what is a good cost and what is a bad cost. So particularly when you were talking about the money that we paid for the vaccine, I wasn't sure where that point was going. If you're saying it was bad to spend money on the vaccine, but it's something that will get us out of the pandemic, that was quite difficult to say, because I think one of the sort of logical conclusions of that is that what you're trying to say with that argument is that we shouldn't spend any money on a vaccine, we should just let the virus run. And that's an argument that needs a lot more time than you could give it as a third speaker. So I think there was just a couple of your points needed to be lengthened a little bit if possible. And then just on the negative side in terms of rebuttal, I think, so Harrison, you did a good job of sort of clawing back the points that they tried to render null and void. But both you and Charlie needed to contend more with the fact that they had brought up the fact that in the definition of the debate that you had agreed to, some of your points were dubious. And so Charlie, I think particularly you should have talked about the definition. You made some really good I liked your comparison with SARS. And I think it was quite apt, but I would be wary of saying things that have just been proposed by minor parties such as the Greens are things that are going to happen, because it is likely that they are not going to happen. That point in particular didn't really compare the cost of the protection measures to the cost of the virus, so it wasn't adding a lot to your argument. So as I sort of said at the start, I thought the definition was quite well given tonight, but it did cause problems for both teams. So in future, when you're thinking of definitions, make sure that all of your points abide by that definition as well. And as a negative team, make sure that you think of a definition and think of possible ways that a definition could be given in case you get a curly one and do need to dispute it. In the end, it did come down to the team who dealt better within that definition, because it was given and agreed to, and I think throughout rebutted a little bit more effectively, and tonight that was the affirmative team. And for the effort and articulation of that definition, which ended up being the hinge point of the debate, the debating award goes to Colin.
I call upon a member of the runner-up team to give a vote of thanks.
Of course, thank you to the opposition team, members who came and watched and supported, Mr Chairman, Sir, Timekeeper and our team. I think it's a good debate, very topical for our current situation, and you did a good job, so congratulations on the win. Good stuff, fellas. Fought valiantly. Thank you.
I call upon a member of the winning team to second that vote of thanks.
Thank you to everyone for coming out tonight and watching. Thank you to the adjudicator, timekeeper and chairman for facilitating the debate, and especially thank you to the negative team. You guys put forward a really good case. It was really well composed.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attendance. I now declare this debate closed.